So this is our last day on David Hume, and we're going to be considering David Hume's theories on morality. There were lots of other moral philosophers during the modern period, and lots of good moral philosophy going on. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, and many other thinkers. But remember, we've been considering just that story about the rationalists and the empiricists, unified by Kant, a story that centers on problems of knowledge and the nature of the human person. So we're looking at Hume's morality not so much as a moral theory, but as a culmination of his philosophy and what it says about what the human person is and its relationship to reason and emotion. The work that we're reading is from one of Hume's inquiries, but it's not the inquiry concerning human understanding that we've been reading so much of. It's another inquiry called the Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. Remember, the two inquiries were later abstracts or popularized versions from his great treatise on human nature, which contained the ideas of both of those works. So the reading for today is from this Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. And just as we've seen, the empiricists are going to get increasingly clear about the nature of what an idea is. Hume's argument here comes from the fact that ideas don't have any motive power. They have no oomph, no ability to move things or motive power. So he says a passion is an original existence, if you will, a modification of existence, and contains not any representative quality. When I'm angry, I actually am possessed with that passion, and it can move me. So he says it's possible that this passion can be opposed by or be contradictory to truth and reason, since this contradiction consists in a disagreement of ideas, considered as copies, with those objects which they represent. So on the one hand, you have ideas, which are copies or representations, paler images, paler copies of impressions. And on the other hand, you have passions, which are original existences, or modifications of my existence, and are capable of moving me and being moved. Whereas ideas, as representations or copies, are not capable of moving or affecting any action. So, since reason alone can't produce any action, he thinks that it's incapable of producing volition or producing any decision. So it is impossible that reason could have the latter effect of preventing volition by giving an impulse in a contrary direction to our passion. And that impulse, had it operated alone, would have been able to produce volition. Nothing can oppose or retard the impulse of passion but a contrary impulse. And Hume is going to say that it's impossible for reason to have any original influence. It's impossible for reason to have any motive force. And it's impossible that it can withstand any principle which has such a power or force or efficacy. So we can sketch out Hume's argument as follows. A passion is an original existence, and nothing can oppose the impulse of a passion but a contrary impulse, another original existence. This would be like saying a billiard ball is an original existence, and nothing can move the billiard ball but another billiard ball, another original object, like a cue or a rock. But ideas are representations or copies of reality that contain no impulse to action. So a picture of a billiard ball or an idea of a billiard ball is not going to move a billiard ball. So ideas as representations are not going to produce any action by producing some force that's contrary to the passion. So no disagreement or contradiction of ideas can ever impede an action. So this is the source of David Hume's famous statement that when we speak strictly, about the combat of passion and reason were mistaken. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. This is a very different model of what the role of reason is in human nature. In Plato, he used a charioteer model in his dialogue, the Phaedrus. Reason is the charioteer that's controlling our passions and our emotions, which are these twin horses. Reason is in control, and that's the model of a virtuous man, is one in whom reason is in control. On Hume's view, it's reason which is a slave to the passions, which are directing its activity. They are the only thing that has any desires, any motive force, any direction. Reason, just judging of relations of ideas, can't think of anything itself to do, but tells you whether it's consistent or efficient to do something in a certain way. So again, we get the result that Hume's empiricism is going to completely deconstruct the ideas of the modern period. The ideas of the modern period of the Enlightenment can be encapsulated by saying that scientific reason can be a guide to human behavior, and that the whole aim of developing scientific knowledge, the whole aim of enlightenment, is to hope that a rational understanding of the world and ourselves will produce a government that is well ordered and to the advantage of all of its citizens. But Hume is saying that when we actually consider what the model of the self is that we get from Descartes, eventually we're led, just as we were led to the conclusion that we can't really know about causality, that we don't really have an idea of what personal identity is, or the self or the soul. We're also going to be led to the idea that reason itself can provide no guide for action. In fact, its passions, just like custom and habit, were the real source of our idea of causality and of identity. So it's our sentiments, our passions, our feelings that are really in charge, and reason is a weak part of human nature that's a slave to those passions, serving them and helping them to get what they want. This distinction of Hume is the source of what's called the is-ought distinction, or sometimes it's called the fact-value distinction. Is what is as a fact. Ought is what ought to be as a value. Sometimes in contemporary versions of ethics, perhaps in your ethics course, you may have heard of the naturalistic fallacy. Hume says that because ideas are just representations, and passions are original existences, you can never deduce an ought, or what you ought to do, or move any action, or move any passion from a fact about the world. So the naturalistic fallacy is trying to deduce facts about morality from facts about the world. Your representation or ideas about the world are not original existences. They have no motive force. They can't make it so that you do anything, or so that it ought to be the case. So from the fact that human beings evolved in jungles, it doesn't follow that it's good for human beings to live in jungles. From the fact that human beings have habitually killed each other in large numbers, it doesn't follow that they ought to kill each other. Or from the fact that human beings have habitually lived in monogamous male-female groups, doesn't follow that we ought to do those things, because Hume thinks that no fact or no idea can ever determine any passion or ought or motive. So you can watch this little video which describes Hume's influence on what's called the is-ought problem. So morality then is a matter of feeling. There'll be another school of moral philosophy that you might learn about in your ethics class called emotivism, that says morality is a matter of emotion. And it owes its origination to David Hume in these passages. So what we call right or wrong is simply what makes us feel satisfaction or uneasiness when we look at a person's character. The judgment that we make is just the pleasure or uneasiness that explains what we mean when we say that they're good or that they're bad. To have a sense of virtue is nothing but to feel satisfaction from a particular type of contemplation of character. That feeling constitutes praise and admiration. We can't go any further. We do not infer a character to be virtuous because it pleases, but the feeling of pleasure is in fact what we mean to be virtuous. So to say that something is right is just to say that we feel a certain type of sentiment of pleasure or approbation at it. To say it's wrong is to say nothing more than that it causes us a certain type of pain or disapproval. Now, Hume recognized that not all types of pain and pleasure are right and wrong, and that sometimes you'll feel pain or pleasure at something that's completely unconnected to its rightness or wrongness. Your favorite team may lose and you may feel displeasure. That doesn't mean that you think it's immoral that they lost or that they're an immoral team. The pleasure, the feeling that you have, comes from a different source. So Hume thinks that there's a very special feeling that we get, which is the moral sentiment. And it's distinct from the feeling of hunger or sexual attraction or self-interest or all of the other types of feelings that might cause us pleasure and pain. And therefore, moral reasoning or moral contemplation involves very carefully separating out our feeling of moral approbation and respect from those other self-interested feelings. So it's only when we think of a character in general, without reference to our particular interest, and consider only the feelings that it produces apart from any desires or feelings of self-interest, that we call something morally good or evil. That particular very faint sentiment of moral approbation, Hume says, is often confounded and influenced by prejudices and biases and our own self-interest. And that's why reflection has to be impartial. We have to consider it as if we weren't the person involved, and apart from our other desires, to see if we feel this special feeling, this special moral sentiment of approval. David Hume was influenced by his earlier contemporary, Adam Smith. Remember, Adam Smith got the position at Edinburgh University that Hume had coveted. And Smith, in his theory of moral sentiments, had proposed the idea of an impartial spectator. He agreed with Hume that morality was a particular type of sentiment, and said that it's the sentiment that an impartial spectator, somebody who wasn't involved, so if you're in an argument with your roommate, of course both of you have very prejudiced and biased views of who's right and who's wrong, because it affects your pleasures and your pains and your other interests. You determine who is really right or wrong by imagining someone who didn't know you and had no interest in either of you or in either of your positions, and seeing what moral sentiments of approbation they would produce. So Hume is advocating that the moral sentiment is the sentiment of approval, the feeling of approval you would feel if you were Smith's impartial spectator, and were viewing it from that detached standpoint. And that idea became the most influential part of a contemporary theory of justice by John Rawls in the 70s, who published a theory of justice, which is still probably the most influential moral theory in public policy and government still today. And his view he calls the veil of ignorance. You see what actions and what arrangements you would approve of, you would feel a sentiment of approval of, if you were behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing who you were and not knowing what your interests were, not knowing who you were going to be. This is similar to the procedure that a mother will sometimes use in deciding how to cut up a cake or cut up a pie or cut up some other good thing that people selfishly want more of. What you can do is have one person cut the cake, and then another person gets to make the first choice of which piece they'll have. You are cutting the cake without knowing, as an impartial spectator, without knowing which piece you're going to get. And from that point of view, your feelings about what's fair and your feelings about what's good and bad will be the real moral sentiment and not any of these other sentiments. So you can watch the little video that follows about John Rawls's veil of ignorance as a basis for a fair distribution of goods in any society. But this should remind you of Descartes' idea of clear and distinct ideas. Remember, Descartes thought that we would separate out each of our ideas and hold them before our true idea detector one at a time to see if they went off. And that was the basis of his new method of certainty and of the scientific method. Now Hume is proposing the same process, except now instead of holding up ideas before the light of reason, this impartial, angelic part of our mind endowed into us by God, now Hume is going to say, let's hold up each action to our sentiments, to our feelings, to our passions, to the one special sentiment or passion of moral approbation, and see what it says. And that sentiment of approbation is determined by our psychological nature, our culture, and of course custom and habit. So again, we get Hume finally reaching the culmination of modern philosophy by showing that if you start where modern philosophy started, with Descartes' mind's eye model, and follow that to its conclusion, you're ultimately led to reject all of the conclusions that modern philosophy was trying to establish. You come to the conclusion that there is no basis for scientific causality and scientific knowledge apart from custom and habit. You come to the conclusion that we don't have any idea of God or of the soul or of personal identity. You come to the conclusion that reasoning is not some special objective, scientifically verifiable method endowed in us by our Creator, but that it's merely custom and habit. It's a set of psychological rules that a biological organism has developed. And lastly, you come to see that reason is not the guide of all human activity, but is merely a slave of the passions. You can see why Immanuel Kant is going to say that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber, and why Kant is going to have to try to look at the problem from a different point of view and revolutionize the basic viewpoint of the mind's eye model, which was the basic assumption of modern philosophy. So on the next slide, you can look at a little video about the veil of ignorance in John Rawls.